Hello and welcome to another episode of Quarantine with Fulbrighters. I am quite excited because we have the first ever Pakistani scientific editor at a nature research journal. We have Fuad Mohammad Khan here with us today, who has a master's in environmental engineering from University of Houston. How are you doing, sir?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
I'm good. So first of all, what is environmental engineering? Is this that HARP thing where the secret societies control the weather? Are you engineering our environment for us, Mr. Fuad?
I wish I could do that. No, that's not even close to what it is, but it's such a broad field. We look at all aspects of environmental management of the cities and societies that we live in, and it includes air pollution, it includes water pollution, it includes water resources. So basically, the water that comes to you and the water that goes out. My focus was on water contamination. So, for instance, when you have the oil industry operating within cities and even outside of cities, they have underground pipeline, they have underground tanks, they leak. That's just like a given. They're always going to leak, and whenever they leak, they contaminate the groundwater. And that's what I studied in my master's. But just to clarify, I do have a PhD as well, which is not a Fulbright uh, adventure. I mean,
And
I
we're
did
not
my
interested in
master's.
this, Fuad. This is only for, no, we are. Should I be calling you Dr. Fuad Khan at this point?
I mean, you should, because I mean, I don't, no, you should, you don't have to, but I think uh, it's important to mention because you can't be a scientific editor without, I mean, it's a scientific position. You need to have at least the basic scientific degree.
So we can absolutely talk about it. What was your focus for your PhD?
My PhD was, I did it at Central European University in Budapest, and I was looking at cities and emissions in cities and how the way cities um, have a way of manifesting themselves. So they can either be sprawl. US cities are very spread out. Everything is flat. There's a lot of suburbs. I live in New York. New York is very vertical. So there's a lot of Manhattan is very vertical, and then other areas are much more urban. So that is something that's called urban form. There are different ways of measuring it, and I came up with a new way of measuring the urban form, and then I was able to connect that to energy consumption in cities. Um, so that was a little bit of a something that I had been thinking about for a long time, and I was already working when I decided to do a PhD. Um, so it was a bit of a passion project for me.
That's quite interesting. I believe we have another connection. You live in Brooklyn. I did my Fulbright master's from Brooklyn College.
I saw that. Yeah, how's it going? How long ago was that?
If you're trying to guess my age, don't. This was 2013 to 2015. What part of Brooklyn do you live in?
I am right now living in Bay Ridge.
Cool. So when you talk about measuring the urban sprawl, uh, is it a way of deciding the quality of life of people? Because I'm assuming with this whole idea of urban depression, urban isolation, how we've been forced into these little cubicle boxes in a capitalist societies where buildings are only made thinking about the worker as opposed to the quality of life of that person living there. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the um, you walk into a PhD with a lot of ambition, and you think that you're gonna prove a lot of things, and then data kind of kicks your ass, and you find out that it's not things are a lot more complicated. One of the ambitions that I had was to find some connection between the aesthetics of a city and energy consumption. So the what a city feels like, what sort of places it offers its citizens, and how does that connect to the energy consumption in cities and other environmental indicators like air pollution and other types of indicators. And certainly, yeah, I think sprawl is a very, I think in many ways it's primarily responsible for the climate change problem that we are facing today. I mean, that's where a lot of the emissions come from in the transport sector. That's where you get, you get, you know, even in the food sector, you get something called a 3,000 mile salad, where you're eating a salad that's flown in from like 3,000 miles. But there's a lot of embedded emissions that you have to take into account. and it would be good to sort of quantify all of these considerations. So there's a lot of architectural theory about how bad sprawl is for you. So you just mentioned the depression that comes with the sprawl, the loss of community, the feeling of not having any connection to your built environment. I think all of that is documented very well in architectural theory, and architects think about that when they're doing their placemaking and they're designing spaces. And they criticize American cities a lot for that, but it's very difficult to quantify that. And so the indicator that I came up was a fractal dimension-based indicator. And the idea was that I would be able to quantify that using my fractal dimension indicator as a measure of complexity, and then complexity can be theoretically linked to the beauty of the city. So it was a very ambitious project in that I was trying to actually measure beauty in a way. So we're talking about urban beauty and the sense of a city and what does it mean to live in a beautiful city. But I was trying to measure beauty in a way, and I was trying to quantify aesthetics. There are many dimensions of it for sure. I think I may be, a little bit of a drop in the ocean with my work. But I think it's very important to sort of get a sense of what's sustainable in terms of these raw indicators like energy consumption, right? I mean, that is something very easy to measure. We know that if we are consuming too much energy, that's not very sustainable. But also get a sense of why we should care about that at a human level, right? So it's not just because necessarily, we are, although that's one aspect of it, we are running out of oil, we are creating carbon emissions, and there's climate change involved. But does that actually add value to our life? Is it actually more more sort of is it a higher standard of living to be living in a suburb as compared to a more urban space like you find in, say, European capitals? Which one is better? We know which one has a lower energy consumption, but what does it mean to be living in a suburb versus living in Paris or living in Vienna? And it's very important to quantify those feelings, to get some sense of what sort of cerebral, not just cerebral, but sort of emotional reasons and feelings we could have to do the right thing. Everybody. And now I'm going on a long tangent.
No, I'd love for you to go on a long tangent, because what you're saying is very intriguing, right? A lot of these things we would assume as a layman from the outside, I would assume this is unquantifiable. The feeling that you get crossing the Brooklyn Bridge, what does that add to your overall quality of life? Can somebody put a number to that? I'm not sure. I saw a documentary about the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, and somebody said something really profound at the end. They said at the end of the day, the test of architecture or the test of any art truly is, how did it make you feel? And you feel something when you look at the Brooklyn Bridge. How do you put a number on that feeling as to the aesthetic of the Brooklyn Bridge? Quantifiably, how much does that improve your life? It's quite intriguing and interesting.
It is. I think it's probably the most important question that you can right now you can answer in the sustainability domain and in climate change domain, because we have all these sort of factoids guiding our way, and every year there's a new climate change report that comes out, and then it kind of lands with a thud, and there are diminishing returns to what you can extract out of creating this sense of doom and gloom, right? And so it's very important to actually imagine what a better world would look like, and how we can create a world that is more meaningful for us as human beings, and that is a better experience for us. And New York is a beautiful city. It's just so. There are pros and cons, of course. There are a lot of bad things that I can say about New York, the public transport and everything, and
If anybody is visiting New York, if a subway card is empty, it's empty for a reason. Don't get in there.
Yeah, don't get in. Yeah, don't get into that card. And but at the same time, I mean, of all the reasons to live in New York, one is that it does offer you time and again like these moments of just sort of breathtaking beauty. Like you would just step out of somewhere and you would just look at the city and it just looks amazing. Sometimes it's the bridges. The bridges are beautiful, and most American cities are not built that way. They're built in a completely they're built by planners um, in a way that is focused on optimizing a, a certain type of efficiency and a certain type of improvement in lifestyle. And I think that is it's important to sort of try to answer those questions quantifiably, because then we could be maybe able to say at some point, we this is this is the better world that we want to build when we are talking about addressing climate change. This is why we need to get rid of urban sprawls, and this is why suburbia is bad. And it's not just because it uses um, more gasoline, but also because when we are in the suburban space, then this is the sort of these are all the indicators that it affects, that we can measure, that it has a negative effect on us. So something else, for instance, that I've written about is the relationship between gender and suburbia, and and how suburbia has and there's a lot of theory about it as well. It's not just me who's writing about it, but I think there's a lot of theory about how these cities are built to suppress the sort of the feminine spirit, or um, um, the feminine self. Eve Ensler used to call it the feminine self, um, and I think that works at many different levels. It works at the level of actually um, suppression of women who are living in these spaces, suppression of um, the feelings within us that are more inclined toward against the sort of a patriarchal mindset. Um, yeah, I mean, there are all these considerations, and I think it would be great to sort of try to measure it. And the way I tried to approach it was to look at it from the perspective of complexity. And whenever you have things that are beautiful, they're beautiful because they are complex. So if you look at, for instance, their complex fractal patterns. So for instance, if you look at traditional architecture, and I'm going to give a different example from what we are talking about. So let's talk about traditional Muslim architecture. And you see all these fractal patterns. I don't know if you're familiar with with the term or not. You see these fractal patterns drawn at various scales. So if you're looking at Old Mosque, or let's say you're looking at Alhambra in Spain, right? It's considered one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. And it is beautiful because no matter what scale we are at, it connects with us at that scale. So if I look at the wall and I'm staring at it, it connects at me at a human scale, so I can see it right there. But then that design scales up slowly, right? So everything is built in. So there's no disconnect between the design at my scale, like what I'm looking at, and then the design of the entire building. So then just through that design, by connecting with this beautiful flower pattern that I'm seeing, but which is like expanding in a fractal way, I'm able to actually connect to the whole grand space. And that's the sense of like sacred and holiness that you get out of a lot of these traditional buildings, whether it's churches or like old mosques, because you are connecting to something that is at a higher level through this sort of fractal design pattern. And it comes from nature. I mean, that's what you see in nature as well. This is why it's good and refreshing for human beings to be in nature. And that's very different from what you see in a lot of modern architecture. That's very different from what you see in a sprawl, where there's a focus sometimes on minimalism, which is good, I think, in interiors. It's an aesthetic choice. But I think outside of that, it's actually bad design. It makes you feel bad to see a lot of modern buildings that are they create spaces that nobody wants to be in. You see that a lot in American cities. If you go to the city centers, they are either they're businesses so that are going to be occupied. The Starbucks is going to be full, but just the public space that is created, you will see that it is completely vacant. Nobody wants to actually hang out in the public space, which is a completely different experience from you get in European cities where people just hang out. They just go to like because it's just beautiful and it's just nourishing to be in these public be in these spaces that are created. Um, so the so that's the kind of complexity that we can measure, and that's what I tried to measure this connection between what scale the design happens at, and you can do that in a city as well. So in sprawl, the design is not happening at the human scale. Suburbs are designed for cars; they're not designed for human beings. Um, and the way one way to measure that is density. Another way to measure what I did was fractal dimension of cities using census data. And yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of work that we can do in this space. It's a growing field. There's work that has come out now from some some scientists at UT Austin that are looking at. They're now actually tracking what our eyes are following when we are walking down an urban street. So they're sort of doing like a heat mapping that you can kind of do. You know, when websites you have your mouse, you get like a heat map of where your mouse is moving. They're doing the same thing with your eyes, and they're trying to again quantify what it is that is attracting our eyes and that is sort of holding our gaze. And I think that's one way of trying to quantify it as well. But I think it's important to quantify. I think it's important to start putting numbers on a lot of this theory because, particularly in America, I think people don't understand. I think America is it's a very literate society, which means that everything people follow the written word by the book. The law is, you know, people really believe in that, but it's not. But the written word has to be written in a very straightforward way. As soon as you start getting into theory, and as soon as you start talking about things that are a little bit, I think, more complex, for instance, architectural theory or psychoanalytic theory, I think that doesn't, even for a lot of, I think, you know, in the intellectual space, is dismissed, and it's definitely dismissed in policymaking. So it's very important to sort of get some sense of those numbers.
So it's interesting. I mean, I have my own ideas about why we see so many fractal patterns in ancient architecture. What might have induced those people to make those fractal patterns? I might have some different ideas. But the way I approach this is because
that's very interesting. I want to know what you're.
I mean, you can probably surmise what I'm alluding towards. But so my entire understanding is through theater, is through stories. Even when you talk about urban depression, I keep thinking of Edward Albee's work, specifically the Zoo story. So even when you're saying these things, I'm thinking about if we are to quantify a feeling, how much of that is just the architecture or how much of that is the stories we tell. I mean, when we talk about the Twin Towers, when they were made, New York thought they were hideous. But then they became a stalwart of New York. They became the image of New York and people started loving them. If you go to the Eiffel Tower, maybe the architecture or the construction is similar. It may be amplified, but it's similar to an electric pole. If Dubai tries to make an Eiffel Tower, or if Bahria town decides to make an Eiffel Tower, which looks the same, which may even use the same material, but it's not going to invoke that same feeling that you get when you look at the Eiffel Tower. Is it the architecture or is it the folklore or the stories we've told about the Eiffel Tower? How much of it is the architecture itself and how much of it is us projecting our own ideas? And that is inducing those feelings.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's something to be said for adding narrative. I mean, we are a narrative-driven species, and that's, I think, there's a lot of theory about how that's the primary function of human mind, is to create stories, and that's the primary function of human rationality. And so narratives have a huge impact in the sense that they, for any experience, they can add profundity to it, right? So if you're looking at the Twin Towers, if you go to the memorial now, I don't know if you've been there. There's a haunting piece there now, in where the Twin Tower 1, I think, used to be, which is it's basically, it would be, it's very modern. It's something that I would totally not consider aesthetically appealing in a traditional sense, but it is so powerful. It's basically this big square um, water. I guess you can call it sort of like a waterfall, where the water is constantly sinking down into this hole. And if you stand by it, and it's huge, and if you stand by it, you get this sense of like drowning and dread, and just like the misery and the sadness of the event really impresses itself on you. And some of it is, of course, I think, some of it is the story that's behind it, that we are all familiar with, and that's become, that's part of our collective experience, and for some people, individual experience as well, and it colors it. Some of it is just the way it is designed. I think it would have been powerful in any other context as well, even if you aesthetically disagree with the piece. It would have been powerful in any other context as well. But I think stories are, of course, very important because they add a layer of profundity. And that's what fractal space and fractal architecture does as well, because what we are getting is layers of meaning. So when you look at something that is designed in a way to have layers of meaning, it can have that physical space. It can be a piece of art that has layers of meaning that you can see immediately when you look at it. And fractal design obviously does that in, I think, the most energy efficient way. So you can have a beautiful painting that has multiple layers of meaning, but I think that requires a lot more energy to create by an artist than an artisan working on a fractal design, who has to do a whole wall, and he has to do 400 walls, but he's still an artisan. He's not just like he's putting some emotional and not the artistic value into what he's doing. And so you're creating layers of meaning through physical design. And sometimes you can create those layers of meaning through narrative. I mean, that happens in almost everything that human beings do, but particularly in our relationships, right? And that's why we like deep friendships, or I guess that's one definition of love, is when you kind of start building a narrative around how you relate with each other, and then that narrative reinforces itself. And I think that sort of reinforces itself again and again. So you can add a whole layer of meaning by just giving something a history, right? And I think, and then it becomes powerful, and then it becomes moving. And I think that's very important to do. But I think there's also, I think there are, in some architectural movements, I think there's a problem with what you can ascribe to them theoretically. So I think if you look at the way a lot of these cities, or a lot of these, for instance, these sort of trademark iconic buildings are designed now, where you get some major architect, you give them a commission, and then that building is supposed to become like the highlight of the city, right? And then they're going to put this on stamps, and they're going to put pictures everywhere. The problem is that there is actually a lot of reliance on a story. So the building looks good in pictures taken from a distance for architectural magazines. It's a beautiful work of sculpture, okay? And and there's an amazing story that you can put behind it. So there's, for instance, a lot of focus now on green architecture. So you can say, oh, this is sustainable and blah 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 this way, and there's a lot of that happening now. Or you can say, like there's what this is like built for. It's a bad example, but like it represents all of the the Guggenheim, like it represents the darkness of like these crisscrossing paths that went nowhere for people who were stuck in like uh, stuck in um, stuck in the Holocaust, uh, and you can tell that story. But then, and by the way, the Guggenheim is great at what it's supposed to do. You can tell that story, but for a lot of architecture, when you actually are experiencing it up close, that story doesn't translate. That's the problem with, I think, a lot of the sort of postmodernist architecture and minimalist architecture, is that it doesn't translate when you're experiencing it up close. It starts to come off, I guess, a little bit like propaganda, because it's a story that doesn't work when you start to see what the intention behind the story, as opposed to it affecting you at a deep level, a human level. I think that's when it starts becoming propaganda. Like you can see, what's going on. Um, and I think there's a lot of propaganda now. There's a lot of you're on mute.
We can probably do an entire podcast on the capitalistic nature of architecture if at one point we talk about urban design, which is made for the capitalist system, which is just boxes. But the other end of the spectrum, if the Hadid is being made on the High Line, it's being made for a certain clientele. So the architect's name, even if the building might be beautiful, it's the name that sells, and how that is capitalized. That in itself is probably just another podcast. These are really, really interesting and intriguing ideas that we can go deep into all of them. But I'm really interested in your story as well. How did you get into all of this? Because all of this is brilliant to listen to. But what did you do in Pakistan for you to develop an interest in this?
Oh, not a lot actually. This is odd because when I came to do my Fulbright in the US, I hadn't actually traveled outside of Pakistan. Well, I did when I was a kid. My parents used to live in Saudi, but I barely remembered that. So all of my lived experience of a space were just Pakistan, Karachi, and various parts, North, Islamabad, Lahore, whatever traveling that you usually do, parts of Punjab. And in my perception of the US was Hollywood. And I expected to have my Hollywood and a lot of American pulp, just tons and tons of
access.
Yeah, but a lot of like literature, Stephen King, basically. That was my perception of the US. And I expected to have my mind blown. I expected to land in the US and be like, this is just an amazing experience to be here. And Houston is the wrong place to go to that.
You expected the Las Vegas. You expected the Las Vegas Strip, and you landed in Houston.
At least the Las Vegas Strip, if not, because I didn't know that this sort of conception of like posh historical urbanism that you get from European cities is not that it doesn't exist in America at all. It's not there, and it's so much of it actually feels kind of cheap. I don't know how else to describe it, like
functional. I think is probably a good way to
functional.
describe
Yeah,
it.
that's a good way.
Even when you talk about Houston, there's a downtown, then there are housing societies that are made so that the workers who work in downtown have a place to stay for their families, with these large highways headed towards downtown. Functional.
Absolutely, yeah. And I came here and it was nighttime, and it was actually kind of dark, because when you're going from the airport to one of the suburbs, there's nothing there. It's just like a long highway, and you don't see any people, and you don't see any amazing buildings, and it's kind of like dark. It's like even compared to Karachi.
So the Stephen King novel that you imagined.
the Stephen King novels had a sense of community that I was like, where is this? Like what is this? What is? And so in a- and I knew that this is the way America is built. It was at by that point, it was the greatest. One of the writers that I follow calls it the greatest misallocation of resources in the history of mankind. But I knew that I didn't know at the time there was misallocation. I knew that it was the greatest allocation, like it was the greatest, wealthiest human project that had ever been done, which was the building of the American suburbs, the highways and everything. And so I kind of got obsessed with why it didn't work. It's like what's going on there? Like this is such a rich environment. There's so much actual wealth here, and the quality of life is just like it's not quite there. There are so many things that are, and at that point I didn't know about I'm an engineer by training, so I didn't know about the concepts of alienation in capitalist societies. I didn't know a lot of these things and what are the underlying patterns. So I basically initially got obsessed with the physical space and why it was not enough to just dump money into a space to create something that is meaningful for human beings and that creates a good standard of living. And so I discovered a lot of these people that I was that I would then go on to build sort of partnerships with. One of them, Nikos Salingaros, is one of the leading mathematicians slash architectural theorists in the world, and he was my external PhD advisor. And he was a disciple of an architect called Christopher Alexander, who is the author of a famous book called The Order of Nature. And he died actually last week. And he's kind of like instrumental in something called the New Urbanism movement, which is very big in the US as well. So then I started reading these people, and I got very interested in it. And I was an environmental engineer. That was my field of study, and I started seeing that in all their theory, they were dropping these hints about the sustainability of the operation as well. Like they would talk about how this doesn't work at that aesthetic level, and then they would say, okay, and it also doesn't work at the sustainability and environmental level, but there was no quantifying it. So I got interested in it, and I was interested in it. My master's didn't have anything to do with it, but I kept reading about it, and then when I decided to do my PhD, it was because the U.S. Census Department had just released their U.S. Census data, and it was beautiful data, and you could play with it. And I looked at it, and I was like, oh, I can prove some of these like theory aspects with it. So, but my initial interest in it really came from the fact that I didn't feel. I think if I had first come to New York, I don't think I actually would have gone down this path because I would have seen that New York has its problems, but I think New York is still you get a sense of
there are many paths one can go down if you live in New York.
That's true. Yeah, that's many paths. Yeah, that's true.
But
yeah.
As somebody who was studying engineering, then you went on a Fulbright. How much did the Fulbright help you to think about these things, and how much does that Fulbright experience educate the work that you do now?
I think a lot. I mean, it's first of all, it's just the opportunity to come and be here. I think it's just it is really great to get to experience that. And then I think I was also I don't know about the later batches, but I'm gonna date myself. You can see the gray beard as well, but I'm from the 2005 batch. So at that point, we used to only get one enrichment seminar experience. I don't know if you guys get that or not, but for some reason, I got two of those, and that's another whole experience. We shouldn't get into, but they basically had an extra one, essentially for young men from Muslim countries, and so I think that was very important. I did a lot of traveling within the U.S., mostly for conferences, but otherwise as well. So I kind of got to see the city. And I think interacting with other Fulbrighters, particularly during the enrichment seminars, and sort of getting a sense in particular of how the Europeans viewed America and what they thought was, what they thought was great about it, what they thought was not good about it. I think that was very interesting. And by the way, I found that they all actually want to move here. I mean, they love their cities as well, but there were so many Fulbrighters who were like, oh, maybe back to the position here or something. So there's something that America is doing right, right? So yeah, I think that was all very interesting for me, and then I think broadly speaking, we're sort of like my generation in particular that came of age after the whole, like the clash of civilizations thing, and we're sort of living in between um, this what a lot of people call living in between stories. Like we don't have a clear sense of you know of what is the dominant narrative. There's no dominant narrative anymore. I think I got to experience that already in my Fulbright experience. I think that was 2005, and the people that I interacted with, the academics that I interacted with, in the professors in my environmental engineering program, they were very clear about almost all aspects of, I think, almost all aspects of understanding really, really American society and how it works and how it should work and how it shouldn't work. Like every female professor that I had talked about the old boys network, and that actually was a surprise to me to realize that this is something that powerful women engineers are also facing in America.
Patriarchy is universal.
It's universal, right? And that's not the impression that you get from when you're living in Pakistan, and you get the sense that and so I think a lot of that was they were really found sort of in many ways foundational years for me growing up here. And then I think I also probably interacted. I really wanted to, because I was so deeply just interested in it's just I guess everyone is, like American pop culture, and I just had this vision of like an American life that I wanted to experience, and so I really tried to do that, and I really tried to experience that from a social perspective as well. And it just I think it really had a transformational effect on who I was as a person. And then not during I didn't meet my wife. My wife is also American. I didn't meet her when I was there. I actually met her in South Korea. But then, I ended up marrying an American as well. So I think all of that would not have happened had I not had the Fulbright journey that I did.
So you had the entire Fulbright experience.
The entire. Yeah, you can say it.
And we keep harping on about this, that it's the experience. It's not just the education. It's almost what you do outside of that classroom that has the real transformational effect on you. And if it's just as important, if not more. Thank you so much, Fawad. It was a pleasure talking to you. I'm quite interested in reading your work as well now. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for talking to me. We didn't even get to talk about my editorial role. But I think it was a really great conversation.
Maybe we can have you
I
again.
hope we can touch base. Yeah, definitely.
For sure.
Yeah.
And thank you everyone for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.